Hello and welcome to the Barcast. I'm your host, Nick Barr, coming to you on a Thursday afternoon. Very chilly spell here in New York. And we're going to get into the social two today, whose keyword is ambición, or ambition. Just some notes off the top. It's great to be back in this region of the Enneagram. I found as soon as we started talking about the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's interesting. I wonder how other people feel, but that's sort of like my home base. And it makes sense as a 4, just from a strictly personal perspective. A 4 has wings on 5 and 3, but then has stretch and release points on 1 and 2. So the 4 touches 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On top of that, my wife is a 2. And so hers is a psychology I know pretty well, and that will certainly shape how I read the 2 and experience the 2 here. And so where the 6, 7, 8, 9 felt like exploring out into the unknown a little bit, here as we get into the 2, I need to check myself for leaping into the familiar unjustly. So let's get into the 2 without further ado. This is the keyword of ambition. Here's Naranjo by way of introduction. In the social 2, the passion of pride manifests as satisfaction in conquering the public. It may not take much intelligence nor the appearance of it to awaken a great passion, but for a social 2, simply being seen as a dumb blonde, quote unquote, would never be enough. A social 2 needs to be someone, and to achieve that, they must use their mind more. As someone who seeks to be important to feed their pride, they must be capable of seducing the social environment, becoming a seducer of groups, a distinguished being, and perhaps not only someone superior, but also endowed with leadership qualities. Ichazo spoke of ambition, but we could describe it as a passion for being, in a sense, above. Through this being above, how does por encima is the word there, above. Through this being above, they gain influence and advantages. This type of person presents themselves to the world as grand or important, unlike the sexual 2, whose primary interest is in being important to their partner, or the conservation type, which, as we will see, is a counter 2. So that's the social 2, and we're talking about a pride that manifests as satisfaction in conquering the public. That's a great introduction. So here is Paolo Baiocchi, the transformation of the social 2. So it'll be interesting. This is going to be from a man's perspective. The 2 and the 4, I think, are both feminine coded or something like that. The 4 is considered the most feminine of the Enneagram types, but I think the reasons for that are sort of complicated. The 2, I would say, is more sort of conventionally feminine in the sense of, like, I think in the United States at least, and maybe Western culture more broadly, the 2, their helpfulness, their focus on the family and what other people need, etc., those are behaviors that are thought of as appealing in women. And so many women will have some relationship with 2, even if they're not 2s. And in fact, there are probably plenty of women who get mistyped as 2 when in fact, they just received strong messaging that 2 behaviors are the kinds of behaviors they should be exhibiting. Anyway, let's hear what Paolo has to say. Therapeutic change for the social 2 involves traveling a path of humanization that, in essence, could be described as the journey from leadership to equality. This journey unfolds in very slow stages: small conquests, crises, discoveries, nourishment for the spirit, healings, and the opening of new existential and relational perspectives. In the following pages, we will describe the main areas of therapeutic change, focusing on dysfunctional structures and ways to avoid them. So he's going to go on position of superiority and role disorder, but notice, we talked about superiority. So superiority is the keyword of the social one. notice how much overlap there is. I think ones and twos, there's so much overlap, and it can be hard to discern between them. Superiority is the keyword of the social one. Ambition is the keyword of the social two, but we're hearing a lot about superiority or being above for the social two. So what is the difference? And we'll get into it, but I just want to name this up front. I think probably the easiest way to get into this is just to remember that the one is in the doing triad and the two is in the feeling triad. So what are the stakes for that? The one's superiority is a relationship to what needs to be done. And if I'm above it all, then I don't need to lose so much energy in trying to fix the way that others are. I just need to make sure that the way that my situation is beyond reproach. Beyond reproach would be a great phrase for a social one whose superiority comes in saying, I get to tell you how things need to be done because look at how I do things. And I do things the right way. Therefore, you do things the wrong way, and I get to tell you how you should be doing them. So there's superiority, there's distance there, but that speaks to the one's passion, which is anger and perfectionism. So the social one has found a way to mask their anger through superiority. But it still comes out as you've got it wrong, pointing out what the other person has wrong. In contrast, we have basically the same word, above, ambition, superiority. The social two has that as well, but their reasons for needing superiority is the reason is not going to have to do so much with perfection or getting things right. It's going to have so much more to do with how they're seen and how they're perceived, because they're in the feeling triad. What does it feel like to be superior? And what does it feel like to have other people feel like I'm superior? So it's going to be a lot more interpersonal, relational here. Let's carry on. So position of superiority and role disorder. The first consideration in the therapeutic change of the social two concerns the sense of superiority they establish toward their own parents, which later gets projected onto other authority figures, whether professional, emotional, etc. The social two places themselves above their parents in a non-authoritarian but ambivalent way. Contrast to the one is taking on an authority role. Not so clearly because the parents couldn't, although that's probably right. I just don't want to get into parent stuff so much here, but we've talked about the one being the little adult. The social two actually place themselves above their parents, but in a non-authoritarian way. So what does that mean? On the one hand, they adopt the role of authority, and on the other, they wish to acquire from that authority the power to shine. So it's like the golden child archetype here. As is often said, the social two wants to, quote, sit at the right hand of the father, end quote. At the psychiatric level, when a social two experiences a psychotic crisis, it often manifests in manic delusions, frequently, at least in our culture, believing themselves to be the reincarnation of Christ. The mythological image of Christ aligns well with the manic structure of the social two, characterized by pseudo-generosity, the internal idealization of affection, and a sense of superiority. So the first step of transformation then is to assume the proper place in relationship to the parents, namely the role of the child. In other words, the social two must be contained by the authority of the parents. So he's taking a psychiatric lens here, but I think it's very helpful, this idea of containment being necessary for the social two. In a very particular way, it is necessary for the social two to relinquish the idea of having to take responsibility for their parents' difficulties. And that's something that, I think the one and the two are going to have similar aha moments in their formative years, right? Some early childhood wounding / strategy / viewpoint that my parents don't have it together. I can't count on my parents to meet my needs. or to recognize that there are needs here. And both of them have taken on a certain level of responsibility. They both have kind of a godlike view of their ability to fix things, right? The one really takes on, it's my responsibility to make things right, quote unquote, again, to restore some kind of paradisiacal perfection. The two has kind of a different, the two's agenda is a little bit more complicated. So let's see what Paulo says here. So how do they become attached to this idea of having to take responsibility? It stems from an incestuous collusion with the father, typically. In many cases, the mother tends to be depressed, neglectful, or childlike, requiring the child to take on a parental role, while the father places the child in a role of equality or superiority. This initial disorder, which persists into adult life, creates problems with boundaries and a lack of clarity in roles. What I think is being said here is the father gives the two, and I don't know, maybe it could be the mother with boys. I don't want to get so into the father-mother stuff, but some parental figure gives shine to the young social two in a way that's basically like a God, having the favor of God, the shine of the smile of God is upon the two. So this initial disorder, which persists into adult life, creates problems with boundaries and a lack of clarity in roles. Thus, the social two relates to others in an unclear manner, behaving in a friendly way and then placing themselves above as a figure of containment, or sometimes also asking to be contained. In this case, it is necessary to develop a great deal of clarity with the social two regarding role definitions, paying special attention to respecting boundaries. So it's complicated. We've heard ambivalent, not necessarily disorganized, but the two isn't so clean with their relationship to this aboveness, because there's a way that in their aboveness, they're taking on an authority role in a sort of non-authoritative way. They're almost taking on an imperturbability. And again, you can hear a little bit of the one there. Remember, one of the one keywords, that's the... who's inadaptability? Maybe I misspoke about... So the sexual one is... the sexual one's keyword is zeal. The self-preservation one's word is that inadaptability, or is that superiority? I would imagine that one is inadaptability. Let me just check quickly. Oh, inadaptability, superiority are the two keywords for the social one. And then the conservation one is preocupación, or worry or concern. Okay, fine. So inadaptability, superiority are two sides of the same coin for Naranjo for the social one. That makes sense here. We like that for this, right? Because this inadaptability, this rigidity, basically this I'm okay, there's sort of this anchored quality that the social two is going to adapt when they're taking on, let's say, the role of the parent. I'm the container. Let me help you contain. But then they're also going to have the need for containment when they're in the golden child role. And then their need for containment in that capacity is going to be very great, because they're essentially looking for God's containment. Let's carry on. Narcissism. And look, every type has a narcissism section, either written or unwritten here. So twos don't have a special claim to narcissism. But the tone that I think good two language is going to take is, remember that this type's passion is pride. Oh, that's the doorbell. Let me pause here. So I think part of what's happening here is you speak to the passion. And if the passion is pride, part of what has to happen in the transformation work is dismantling pride and first exposing pride. So Paolo continues, becoming aware of narcissistic traits in one's personality is an important task. The social two exhibits a narcissism based on territorial and sexual competition. The need to stand out and conquer in these areas arises from a shift from emotional self-esteem to territorial self-esteem. The fundamental traumatic experience involves maternal emotional deprivation, leading to a state of profound despair, a feeling of not being loved. The sense of loneliness and deep lack, essentially a depressive experience, transforms into a sense of incapacity and inferiority in competition for territory or in the pursuit of a partner. Thus, there is a shift from the system of affection, warmth, and emotional connection to the reptilian system, which is relationally cold but capable of generating the enthusiastic drive for territorial conquest and dominance over a partner. He continues, the positive emotions that emerge from the reptilian zone of the brain relate to an authentic manic force characterized by enthusiasm, firm confidence in one's abilities and perceptions, impulsivity, and a determined sense of bright objectives that the manic state makes appear within reach. The warmth of these positive sensations, amplified by the dominance of visceral behavior, replaces the lack of genuine intimacy in relationships, where there is a profound emotional devaluation. This devaluation and the resulting depression translate into distancing through feelings of indifference and hatred, often leading to a certain autistic withdrawal in emotional relationships, accompanied by a disdainful and contemptuous attitude. Just as a child typically exhibits an attitude of angry indifference toward a mother who has been absent for a long time, the mammalian heart of the social two withdraws from emotional relationships. At the core of the deep wound of affection in the social two lies a nucleus of despair which, when reactivated, produces a cooling of relational potential, a coldness that transforms into indifference and emotional disengagement. Similarly, erotic mania leads to a constant attitude of sexual seduction, another source of warmth in response to the void left by maternal emotional warmth. Wow, he's really going after it. And maybe one day I'll have Terry sit here and she can speak to her experience. I'm not going to try to speak for her here, but what's being said here? So at the core here, something goes haywire with the relationship with the parents, as it does with, essentially all the types. But in the case of the two, there's this dual being, the God and the Son at the right hand of God, or the golden child, and the parent. So they've taken both of those and sort of internalized them. But it's come at an expense, which is like regular containment from a parent. Here he's focusing on the mother. Regular emotional containment for when you're vulnerable or when you're needing assurance. So there's a deep deprivation there of their actual needs being received and reflected back and catered to. So deep down, there's a lot of a state of profound despair. There's a state of loneliness. There's a state of lack, a deeply dark and depressive and cold experience. Very early, the two does something remarkable, which is essentially shift from that or split from that, and instead choose to activate what Paolo's calling the reptilian system, which is relationally cold. You're no longer in I, thou. I think he's going to talk about that later. You're no longer in interpersonal relationship, but you're now in kind of conquering mode. And in that mode, there's a lot of warmth and there's a lot of zest and there's a lot of positivity. And the two is a great conqueror. This is the conquering subtype, ambition, right? The conqueror, conquest. And, you can hear the 8, again, I said this in the introduction to the 2, but notice how much 8 there is in that too, this idea of conquest. The eight has that same, I would say, reptilian energy that Paolo is describing here. And in that energy, there's this drive for conquest, whether that conquest be through sex or actual potentially like status at work or something like that. Paolo is evoking imagine the child who is angrily indifferent to their mother, right? I'm fine. What are you talking about? That kind of energy is very deep with the 2, so deep that they're not going to have access to it, nor would others. It's not obvious. What will be obvious is their false abundance, as I think Naranjo says in the introduction to the 2. This overflowing okayness that itself is a response to and a denial of the deep lack. He continues, a significant therapeutic shift for the social 2 occurs when they stop seeing themselves as merely neurotic and begin to recognize the harm they can inflict on others, what Fritz Perls referred to as discovering one's criminal nature. In my own experience, I spent many years in therapy searching for the causes of my suffering and striving to enhance my well-being and strength. When I discovered my capacity to hurt others, I changed course and began focusing more on how my actions affected others, with the goal of increasing my well-being and strength. My self-study shifted from a search for weaknesses to an analysis of how I behaved unethically toward others and unconsciously acted as an exploiter. Fritz Perls categorized people into 2 simple groups, neurotics and criminals. Neurotics, I love this, by the way, this is so good. Neurotics tend to put their own needs second to meet the needs of others, while criminals exhibit the opposite imposture. They pursue their own goals directly, placing the needs of others in the background. While everyone has areas of life where one or the other of these attitudes prevails, it's crucial to understand which structure predominantly governs our behavior. He continues, a neurotic can learn a series of skills to help assert themselves, integrate guilt, bear the weight of loneliness, and develop abilities for differentiation and leadership. Neurotics tend towards submission, so therapy must help them develop the ability to assert their territoriality and dominance, to restore their internal balance, and make their relationships with others ethical. Frequently, to achieve those therapeutic steps, individuals need to examine and heal childhood wounds to recover lost strength, enabling them to experience the journey toward independence and assertiveness. On the other hand, someone with a criminal character structure tends to impose their own rules on others, either implicitly or explicitly. An aggressive criminal structure imposes through force, while a manipulative character achieves the same goal using less visible means of control. In relationships, the criminal structure tends to skew the balance of giving and receiving in their favor. Therapeutic change for these individuals involves becoming aware of how they seek to occupy positions of power and control over others, and how they attempt to gain advantages at others' expense. So that's a great framework, criminal and neurotic, and discovering, where your work is. And I think the two does have to discover their own criminality. that seems core to the experience of the 2. Whereas like the 4, it would probably be accurate to describe some of the growth that Terry and I have gone through together in relationship is, criminality abounds, but I think I was less in touch with my neuroticism and more blatantly a criminal. And Terry was more blatantly, I'm not sure if neurotic, but I think she had to get in touch with her criminality. And so that might be the case for 4s in general, right? 4s who, keep in mind, these are keywords: drama, hate, tenacity. These are more intense manifestations where the criminality, it's not hard to point to a 4 doing something that was harmful. 4s tend to commit those kinds of acts, but then also be obsessed with them, and they're really foregrounded for the four. So the four's work may have to be to get past the surface criminality into the deeper neurotic stuff, and the two might have to do the inverse and get into their deeper criminality. Continuing. One initial change concerns developing empathetic understanding toward others. A social two benefits from developing a sense of guilt and becoming aware that their actions threaten their belonging and risk exclusion. Now that's going to be hard for a social two potentially to hear. I need to develop a sense of guilt. Twos, I think, tend to feel very guilty. Keep in mind, this is a type with the one wing, so the inner critic is strong with ones and twos. In particular, I would say. And so what is the guilt that Paolo is talking about here? I think this kind of guilt goes hand in hand with responsibility, taking responsibility. So not the guilt of the child caught with their hand in the cookie jar. That kind of guilt, I think, is going to be familiar to two. This is the kind of guilt of like, oh, I did something as an agent that harmed somebody else. My actions, the weight of my actions. The two. There's something about punishment, here. I think where the two's punishment comes from isn't so clear, but the two is concerned with being punished, and so. Part of taking on responsibility and taking on guilt is facing the fear of that punishment. It's helpful for them to stop finding good justifications for every unethical act committed. A shift in this direction involves developing the capacity to accept criticism and uncover one's deeper motivations. According to Pearls, every criminal has a secret life and a public life, the latter being a socially acceptable facade that hides their transgressions to avoid legal or social penalties. Criminal structures contain a series of hidden intentions lived in secret and invisible to others. The secret intention of the social two is to be adored. Adoration could be another word, keyword here for the social two, to achieve power and to gain individual success. In contrast, their social facade is one of warmth, relationality, and a willingness to help in a magnanimous and loyal manner. Significant change, therefore, involves speaking honestly, revealing selfish intentions, confessing unethical actions, and exposing one's deep vulnerabilities. It talks about, giving and asking for feedback, the power of feedback. The collapse of justificatory thoughts, i.e., justifications of why one is the way one is, the collapse of all that opens the possibility of seeing one's actions more clearly and reveals to the consciousness the passionate motivation driving them. And, from this realization of these true intentions, and what are these true intentions? Basically, this power, power hungry, very power hungry, seeking adoration. And then why seeking adoration even underneath that is then contacting that depression, that lack. So there's multiple steps here for the two. The two kind of has a harder path potentially than some types because of how much abundance and okayness and generosity and helpfulness and loving the two displays. And authentically too, right? Like this book is very uncompromising, very hard, but those who have twos in their life really do feel loved by the two. But there is a falsity that's present there as well. And moving through that falsity, I think, is very difficult. So from this realization, an initial sense of guilt can finally emerge, along with the ability to empathetically perceive others. Over time, these transitions tend to encourage ethical development, where the tendency to place oneself above others subsides, opening more genuinely to the needs of others. In my experience, he says, I began to realize that many of the emotions I felt were, in fact, narcissistic. Among them, I highlight territorial mania, protector mania, exhibitionist desires, and erotic sexual desires for conquest. These narcissistic emotions are exhilarating, intense, pleasurable, and above all, capable of creating a positive emotional barrier against the difficult emotions experienced by the organism. Again, there's that splitting there. He calls it from the mammalian to the reptilian. There might be other ways to name that splitting, but reconnecting to oneself as an organism, with needs, is work for the two. Underneath the narcissistic structure of the social two, he says, lies an organism in pain, whether due to childhood wounds and altered emotions or to the current lack of awareness and fulfillment of one's needs, caused by investing nearly all energy into maintaining narcissistic processes. In other words, the organism that bears the wounds and deprivations of childhood ends up experiencing chronic emotional lack in adult life. Consciously, these needs and emotions are not considered or seen, just as the proud person pays little attention to others' hearts as to their own. In the case of territorial mania and protector mania, placing myself in the parental role, over stimulating these visceral components leads me to experience a sense of omnipotence and superiority. It continues, territorial mania, which, he describes basically his workaholism. The mechanism triggering territorial mania has to do with competitive challenges. Another man, real or symbolic, accepts the challenge and is really or symbolically defeated, reinforcing the excited and omnipotent state of mania. Another powerful fuel for territorial mania was my tendency to challenge death and feel omnipotent by practicing risky sports, motocross, skydiving, hang gliding, martial arts. Sounds like a fun guy. I want to go back though here, this part. Territorial mania. I'm just looking for the translation. So I guess I don't really know what he means here about territorial mania and the competitive challenge. Why real or symbolic defeat reinforces the excited and omnipotent state of mania. I guess there's sort of a titillating quality that he's describing here, where in this reptilian mode, where we're in I, it, not I, thou territory, and let's say he's using workaholism, so, there's a project that needs to get done, there's these other actors, and there's these challenges. As the type goes through that, they are able to almost sort of like have these battles that are happening almost on a symbolic or private plane, private realm. And I may win, I may lose, but I get the thrill of that kind of risk, essentially. So when he's describing his skydiving, for instance, there's sort of a man, I guess that he's saying, that goes skydiving and dies. And so there's this thrill there, as well as a sense of omniscience, because he gets to sort of play out the drama of winning and losing, of living and dying, etc. So different than the 8, who really does live that drama. So the 8 really does have conquest and war and wages it a little bit more directly in the workplace. The 2 almost sort of like the 2 seems to want all of that lust of the 8, but to do it in a safe, or maybe more than safe, ambiguous way. They're not going to be as direct in their confrontation. He continues, another source of fuel was relational. I surrounded myself with less capable, less developed people who depended on me, ensuring I could continuously win in a secret competition disguised as pseudo-compassionate kindness, which I will discuss shortly. This secret internal competition, very kind of covert, everything that the 2 is doing here, aimed to infinitely stimulate territorial mania. The effect this attitude evokes in others is devastating, translating into a slow and chronic sense of devaluation that poisons relationships with those around the social 2, leading others to become dependent and adoring. All of this secretly aims to enslave others, subjecting them to my will. Heavy stuff, but powerful. An ingredient of the structure involves the tendency to blindly believe in one's own ideas and cognitive maps. Disguising competition as pseudo-compassion. Every mammal, near a child or cub, experiences an omnipotent sense of love and generosity that serves to overcome the difficulties and fatigue of a challenging biological duty. In the case of exhibitionist desires and erotic sexual drives, the narcissistic emotion engendered by the social 2 promotes constructing an idealized self-image as a winner. Beautiful and desirable. I think we can just keep going here. Erotic sexual desire activates sexuality and infatuation. Exhibitionism fueled by public displays where attention and applause can be captured. Sometimes, half-jokingly, I've heard it said that the social 2 has a pornographic mind. This exaggerated imagination is a form of addiction, similar to compulsive work or the pursuit of competitive territorial challenges, allowing the stimulation of erotic desire to be infinitely sustained to generate pleasurable emotions. It's a lot of kind of specific language that he's using here, but I think it's powerful. So let's carry on. What remains behind? Okay, finishing up with this social 2 here. I know we ran long, but this is a good chapter. So what remains behind? He continues, my own story is one of long-term work on awareness and careful listening to the feedback offered by others to recognize my work dependency and my sense of superiority in personal relationships. Once I achieved this understanding, began a process of detoxification that undeniably involved connecting with an organismic pain I did not clearly know, but had already experienced during moments of crisis. After several years, I was able to concretely modify my professional habits. So this is a real workaholic, his territorial mania, as he describes it. Significant injection of relational and loving strength received during a 1-month community experience with Irving Polster. He entered a mildly depressive state that persisted over time. After months, I realized my deepest wound was connected to the feeling of belonging, to my relationship with my mother, my group of friends, and to the panic and emotional despair I had experienced. Several years to process traumatic losses. The dynamic of superiority, the need for competition. There's competition, that's a word in the 4. The indifference stemming from hidden despair and the individual need for glory and adoration oppose, in the social 2, the possibility of relating as an equal to others. That's really at the heart of all 3 numbers in the feeling triad, isn't it? The possibility of relating to others, as an equal, the possibility to be in truth. I think truth is a central issue for 2s, 3s, and 4s. So now that we're moving into the feeling triad, we're really moving into relationship. And the 2 is a tricky one because the 2 presents as very relational. They're the helper. They have a need to be needed. At the same time, real relationship is not there for them. Truthful relationship. He's using the word narcissism a lot. But for the 2, relationship exists to demonstrate my superiority. This is the ambitious social 2. The proud 2. He continues, the entire narcissistic structure of this trait is founded on the denial of the emotions of others, whether these stem from the particular relationship with the proud individual or independent events. Similarly, others' needs are also denied, as they do not appear important in the theater of the proud individual's consciousness. Personal narcissistic desires, in fact, always take center stage, leaving others' needs and emotions in the shadows. Here I think he's being a little bit hard on 2s, of course, on himself, and that's something to listen for with the 2. So he's attributing this denial of emotions to narcissism, but wouldn't it also be the case that the 2 is denying their own emotions first and foremost? Exposure to authentic need, to raw emotionality, to vulnerability is excruciating for the 2 because it puts them face to face with their own self-abandonment. That's, I think, really important to call out. The practice, he continues, of Martin Buber's I-thou relationship presented for me a true remedy to the narcissistic trap. Again, he's going to feedback. He credits someone named Paolo Quattrini. It involved asking people what they thought I felt about them, asking people what they thought I felt about them, revealing to others the feelings my heart held for them, and finally asking and listening with genuine interest to what they felt about me. This task, which may seem trivial, is actually very challenging for someone affected by such deep narcissism. Training oneself to listen to what one feels for others, to acknowledge those feelings, whether vulnerable or strong, and to make an effort to perceive the same in others, are tasks that help shift the point of view of consciousness from a narcissistic life to an organismic life. You could think of a king in a castle, he continues. I'm not going to go deep on that metaphor. But he returns time and again, connecting with people on a level of equality. So the 2 is really the mirror of the 4 in so many ways. And of course, I'm particularly interested in this as a 4 married to a 2, but the 4 whose keyword for the social 4 might be abasement or shame or drama. Also the sexual 4 whose word might be hatred or competition. There's a constant, deep comparison. It's so deep that it's hard for the 4 to even see, but they're always comparing themselves to others, real or imagined, so that they can occupy a lower position. Envy. 2s are always in competition and comparison with others, real or imagined, so deep that they might not be aware of it, so that they can place themselves in a position of superiority, pride. So very similar in a lot of ways, despite having quite opposite manifestations. And of course, each is the shadow of the other to a large extent. The 2 longs for the truthfulness of the 4, the rawness of the 4, the authenticity of the 4, the bleeding kind of nakedness of the 4. The 4 longs for the loving abundance, radiance, fullness of the 2 that each perceives in the other type. Closing out here, he titles the section Emerging from Anesthesia. Going back to his organismic emotions, from lizard to mammalian brain. And so, in his framing of it, this is when he, or the social two, goes back to the original situation where, as a mammal, they had needs. And somehow they were let down. Someone who maybe normally loved them didn't in that moment. Or maybe they were neglected or ignored. Maybe they were blamed. All the denied emotions belonged to the category we might call vulnerability: shame, panic, despair, resignation, guilt, self-devaluation, mistrust, jealousy, envy. I realized that I did not yet know how to name these difficult emotions that I felt. He began to show those emotions, and in doing so began to understand and recover the lost language of my organism, which you could call humility. Right? That's the redemptive virtue of the two, humility. Recognizing that I too am an organism, I too have needs, I too am vulnerable, I'm squishy. As Gedling states, it was like beginning to relate and dialogue with a part of myself I did not know, one I started to approach with care, containment, and firmness. Remember, that's the containment that's mentioned at top. The two has to ultimately reoccupy the place of a child, contained somehow by the parents. Of course, that's self-work that happens in one's internal system. The next step was to understand the needs these emotions spoke of. I began to use my capabilities, usually wasted on professional and personal power, to care for those needs. Over time, I discovered that they wove together the fabric of my emotional, personal, and family history, and that many of the most painful moments in my life were merely echoes, repetitions of those original wounds. So I began to work myself in two main directions. The first was to develop existential antidotes to soothe these emotions, much as a mother soothes a child's anguish with an act of containment and love. The second was to heal, one by one, the wounds that made those emotions so strong and recurrent. Long, still unfinished process, I came to experientially understand the extent to which I was responsible for my emotional states and how deeply rooted they were in my emotional history. He describes these emotions as not belonging to a single level, but having layers, like Dante's Inferno. And the way he structures this, in my experience, he says the deepest layer is affective despair, followed by panic, and above that, resignation. At a still more superficial level are jealousy and envy, followed by shame and mistrust, and finally, at the most superficial layer, self-devaluation and guilt. So that's his own archaeology there. I wouldn't say that has to be true for all twos. But one word that he doesn't use there that I think a two has to contend with abandonment, I think. The two was abandoned, and all the feelings associated with that abandonment are relevant here. And I notice that he doesn't use that word so much. But I think the two experiences dual abandonment. On the psychological level, they abandon their own needs, and they abandon their own self. They abandon their own organism, essentially. And then in the family history, there seems to have been some abandonment by a parent that caused them to take up this elevated role, which they feel so attached to. I think that's the problem for the two, is they're quite attached to this elevated role, the golden child role. And so for them to fully connect all of that positivity with a pretty dark origin story, I think is very difficult. I think the two actually can do that pretty easily and then still turn it into a positive. It made me who I am today, right? The two is always going to move toward false abundance, toward pride, toward I'm fine, I made it, this is great, now I'm here to help others. So for the two to actually spend time in, what if it wasn't worth it? What if all this abandonment doesn't have a happy ending? And to sit in that sorrow is, I think, of importance for their transformation work. Okay, that was the social 2, to be continued next time.